Dear students, today I am going to discuss the topic Development of Parliamentary Democracy in Britain. Parliamentary democracy was firmly established in Britain by first half of the 20th century, and it was a long continuous process which had its origin in the 13th century when King John adopted Magna Carta, which acted as a protection to individual liberty. In 1295, a model parliament was founded by King Edward I. In the British system of parliamentary democracy, the head of the state is the monarch, while the head of the government is elected and comes from parliament. In Middle Ages, parliament was represented only through one house, that is, the House of Lords. In 1215, Magna Carta was promulgated, which limited the power of the English monarch. The Magna Carta is considered one of the cornerstones of democratic government. King Edward I created a model parliament mainly for the purpose of imposition of taxes. The 14th century witnessed a gradual separation of the two chambers of or houses into House of Lords and House of Commons. During the rule of the Tudor dynasty in England, which started in around 1485 CE, the influence of Parliament was minimal. From 1603 onwards, with the coming of the power of the Stuart kings, parliamentary evolution was characterized by a tussle of power between the Stuart kings and the Parliament for ultimate sovereignty. All this led to a civil war in 1642, during which no parliamentary session was conducted. The Civil War established the legal sovereign authority of Parliament once and for all. The initiation of some of the practices associated with modern parliamentary system in Britain, like party system, the doctrine of ministerial responsibility, cabinet system, public reporting of parliamentary debates began from 1688 to 1832. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 during the regime of James II established the ultimate sovereignty of the parliament. The Bill of Rights in 1689 reinforced this by advocating for a constitutional or limited monarchy with supreme parliament. The parliamentary system of early 1800s had changed little in over a century. Though the powers of the monarchy had been weakened, parliament was still dominated by rich landowners who saw it as their God given right to rule without reference to the masses. Voting was a privilege, not a right. Only about 4% of the population had the right to vote. Women were excluded altogether. Before 1832, the British Parliament was not properly represented. The House of Commons consisted of two members from every county and two or one member from every borough. The county members were elected by those inhabitants who had freehold property of the annual value of 40 shillings. County members were required to possess landed property of the annual value of £600. Thus, the people who elected the members, they had to have property qualifications, and also the members who would be representing the people, they had to have property qualifications as well. So there were three kinds of boroughs. Pocket borough, a single landlord owned the entire freehold and consequently was in a position to nominate or return the members from that constituency. Then rotten boroughs, those where the inhabitants were so few that the landlord could practically secure all the votes by bribes or some other form of influence and thus could ensure the return of himself or his own nominee to the parliament. The third kind of boroughs had no special name. Those might be called democratic constituencies, where the number of inhabitants with the right to vote was large enough to represent a fairly general public opinion. Thus, there were three kinds of boroughs. Example of pocket borough, Old Sarum. For many years, it was a plain green hill and yet sent two members to parliament. The Industrial Revolution resulted in a significant change in population from one section of the country to another. As a result, Manchester, with a population of 1,33,000, Birmingham with 85,000, and Leeds, with a population of 83,000, had no representatives in the parliament. On the other hand, Sams of Tees and St. Banks had representations in the parliament. Thus, prior to 1832, the British Parliament appeared to be an undemocratic body, particularly the House of Commons, which lacked proper public participation. The Crown and landed magnates had complete control at that time. Post industrial revolution, the towns such as Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Liverpool, Sheffield, Halifax, and Bradford grew. However, none of these towns were represented in the parliament. So, and after industrial revolution, several towns grew, but they had no representation in the parliament. On the other hand, many depopulated minor boroughs such as Old Sarum, Newtons, Gatton, Bramber, Bosini, Heddon, and Brackley had continued to send delegates to parliament. So there are attempts at reform. In this context, some attempts were undertaken in the 18th century to bring about parliamentary reforms. The first attempt to overthrow the customs of his time was Pitt the Elder. Following that, John Wilkes, a notable politician during George III's reign, proposed some parliamentary reforms, but he was not successful. In 1780, the Duke of Richmond sought significant changes in the franchise and distribution. Pitt the Younger attempted to disenfranchise several of the tiny boroughs in 1785 by presenting a law to that effect. However, due to resistance from the Whig and King George, he was unable to pass the law. Meanwhile, the start of the French Revolution and the Napoleon's accession to power slowed the nation's effort to enact parliamentary reforms. It was after the downfall of Napoleon in 1815 that attempts were made again to reintroduce reform movement with added momentum. The French Revolution of 1830 reignited popular support for parliamentary reforms in England. In the general election of 1830, the reform became the Whigs' manifesto. The Whigs won majority in the House of Commons, led by Earl Grey. Grey was appointed Prime Minister. In 1831, a member of Grey's government, John Russell, introduced a reform bill in the House of Commons but without any success. When the reform bill was introduced for the second time, it was passed in the House of Commons but it was defeated in the House of Lords. And finally, the bill was passed in the year 1832 when Lord Grey was the Prime Minister of England. Now, the Reform Bill introduced several reforms. Reform Bill of 1832 that it had the provisions where all boroughs with less than 2,000 inhabitants were disenfranchised. Boroughs with a population of 2,000 to 4,000 were to send only one member to parliament. 146 thus gained were distributed among the large counties and large towns. So the Act provided for the maintenance of a register of voters, for the division of constituencies into convenient polling districts, and for the limitation of the polling to two successive days. Now, the Act of 1832 undoubtedly proved to be a turning point in modern English history. It was a great political and parliamentary achievement. The Reform Act 1832 enhanced the number of voters. Then the act transferred the political power from the privileged section of the landlords to the middle class people. Lastly, the act enhanced the importance of the House of Commons as a true representative body. Despite its many advantages, the Reform Act of 1832 was not without flaws. The working classes were it did not give voting rights to the working classes, though they fought hand in hand with the middle class for reform measures. In spite of the drawbacks, the Reform Act of 1832 forms a landmark in the constitutional history of England. It has been rightly called by Trevelyan as the modern Magna Carta of England. Then, um, um, then the Reform Act of 1867, it introduced certain reforms like working class, industrial working class were given voting right, and several other reforms were introduced, like in boroughs, the right to vote was given to all those leaseholders, lodgers, and occupiers paying annual rent of £10. 11 boroughs with a population of less than 10,000 were completely disenfranchised. Then the Ballot Act of 1872 came into being. A ballot act, this act actually allowed voters to vote anonymously and without fear. It also aided in the elimination of election related corruption. Then came the Reform Acts of 1884 and 1885. The third Reform Act was passed in 1884 in the time of Gladstone. By this act, voting right was granted to agricultural laborers, and it was the highlight of the act. Then the Reform Act of 1885 introduced that boroughs with less than 15,000 populations were completely disenfranchised. The whole country was to be divided into as many constituencies as there were seats, and each constituency was to send one member to the House of Commons. Then the Parliament Act of 1911 aimed at establishing the supremacy of the House of Commons. It was laid down that if a money bill was passed by the House of Commons and sent to the House of Lords at least 1 month before the end of the session, it was to be considered to have been passed even if it was rejected by the House of Lords. Moreover, the Speaker of the House of Commons was granted the authority to certify whether or not a bill was a money bill. Thus, the House of Lords was completely deprived of its control over budget. The term of the House of Commons was reduced to 5 years from 7 years. Then came the Representation of People's Act or Franchise Act of 1918. By this act, women obtaining 30 years age and above were given the right to vote. The act also abolished property qualification and assimilated the county and borough franchise. Then every man was to register as a parliamentary voter if he had reached the age of 21. The women were also made eligible to be a member of the House of Commons. Furthermore, the persons who served in the Air Force, Navy, or Army could become voters. Then came the Act of 1928. The Reform Act of 1928 put the women voters on the same voting as men. Women of 21 years of age were given the right to vote. The act established universal suffrage in the country, and England became a completely democratic country. So, through a continuous process and efforts, and by passing of these acts, a democratic form of government was established in England.